and welcome to Boxset, Binge the Bible, the podcast from Seven Vineyard, where we are listening through the entire Bible in a year. My name is Bern, Leckie. I'm joined by Owen, Lynch.
Hello.
We are in the middle of one of the most strange, epic, awesome, harrowing, also glorious, but also weird books of the Bible called Ezekiel. How have you been finding it, Owen?
Yeah, it's been really troubling once again to listen to. Majority of it has, but there has been a bit of hope that's been creeping in right at the end. I guess for me, it feels tumultuous because it's a big picture. It's a story of a tumult, a time of tumult and chaos for a whole nation, not just for an individual, right? And although we are kind of seeing it on an individual level as well, aren't we? We're getting an insight into Ezekiel and where he's at and his personal experience in this, particularly with the loss of his wife. But yeah, it's troubling and disturbing, and I think reflects probably the times in which it was being written.
I think it's worth reflecting on what are those times and how would have people interpreted this at the time. Can we get closer into their heads so we're not just looking at it and sort of thinking about how it would be if that was happening today? So the historical context is Israel, the nation of Israel that lives in the promised land of Israel that God had brought together. A lot of it, all the northern kingdoms had already fallen and gone into exile. There was a southern kingdom that was remaining around the capital Jerusalem where the temple was. They felt they were safe. They felt they were in the presence of God. They felt they were protected. They felt they were doing lots of things right. But then along come these prophets with words of warning and doom, really, because they know what's on the horizon and they know that it's all going to fall apart. And this threat from the north, the re-emerging Babylonians, end up conquering and taking away the leaders. And like we said last week, Ezekiel seemed to be one of those people who was taken away in the first wave of exiles. He seemed to start his sharing things from God in between then and a time that was coming very soon after, where Jerusalem would fall and the city would fall and the temple, that centre of God's presence, would be destroyed. So obviously, as you say, very, very traumatic. But just trying to get into the heads of why it was so traumatic for them and why did all that sort of religious stuff and political stuff, the capital's fallen or the temple's fallen, what did that have to do with life as a whole, with justice and society and order and everything else?
In a very practical way, almost like an historical way, one can assume that was associated with the breakup of the nation state, of the dissolution of all the systems and structures that enable 70 million people, let's say, in Britain to actually live alongside one another in relative harmony. Whether that's the courts, the parliaments, the business, social structures that support the most vulnerable, all those things were falling apart at this time, and that would be hugely traumatic in our day, and I'm sure it's equally traumatic then. But I think that we do see Ezekiel referring to this, don't we? The breakdown of society, the lack of care for the most vulnerable in society seems to be a major cause of concern, and it's not just compassion that drives him; it's a sense of injustice, and I see him linking that to this idea of holiness, which for him was significant because let's not forget, Ezekiel was a priest, and actually on the day that Ezekiel turned 30, which was the age that a priest would enter the temple to start his life of service, well, that was the day that he has this vision of the throne of God. So for a priest, holiness was everything. That's what, because the temple was a sacred place, a place of holiness, cleanliness, spiritual and physical cleanliness were absolutely essential to serve as a priest in the temple. So for him, holiness has an outworking in terms of his ceremonial cleanliness, but it also has an outworking, according to Ezekiel, in what society is doing to the most vulnerable and the poor, and what does justice look like for those people in society. And I see him connecting that with holiness. Do you notice that yourself?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of reflect on the difference between like how we'd see that today if something similar happened today,
right?
And how they saw it then. I think one of the big differences between today and then is we've come up with so many other structures other than religion and other than God, other than anything faith-based at all, to govern how we run things, to govern courts, to govern research into how we understand the world, all that sort of thing. We've separated God from a lot of that quite a long time ago, like centuries ago, really. And the separation's very profound, I think, to the point where if someone told you that, St. Paul's Cathedral had fallen and there wasn't a brick standing on a brick these days, you'd probably have, I don't know, a few hundred people really upset by that, maybe a few thousand people really upset by that, and millions going, oh, that's a shame. That's one less thing to do next time I go to London to go and see that. Whereas, I don't know what the modern equivalent would be. Even if you said that Parliament had fallen down for some reason, well, that would be obviously like be a big story, but they'd find somewhere else. So I think what we got to grasp from what Ezekiel's seeing, what his people are going through, is that there wasn't that sort of separation. There was a common understanding across the ancient Near East that God and their politics were connected, that God and all the depths of things that were bigger than anyone could control by themselves, they were connected. And God and justice, they were connected too. And I think the tragic thing that you start to see, that I'm noticing in what Ezekiel's talking about, is that God, the separation, the leaving, the missing of God's presence wasn't just a thing that they were being threatened with, or warned about. It was something that already seemed to have been happening outside of temple life. So people were suffering. People were suffering injustice. People were suffering and not finding the presence of God helping them, correcting them, bringing justice, righting wrongs. That was the things that God wanted for them, and it was the life that people were suffering through. And so, in a way, God was just pointing out that you've already sort of lost track of how society could work and should work and be ordered, and that's the problem. And then when they look back to the temple to say, well, how do we fix that? There wasn't a clear way to fix that and connect with God, because it was all obscured by these idols coming in. Now, what were idols? Idols were things, ways that people looked towards to solve problems that they had. So we read through most of the Old Testament, there's stuff about Asherah poles. Do you know what do you know who Asherah was? Asherah was an idol of fertility. Why would you go to an idol for fertility? Well, because you want fertility, because you want babies. Problem, not having babies. Solution, I don't know, maybe pray to God. Or we've heard about this other God who specialises in fertility. So as well as the God that we know about, why not set up some Asherah poles? And God's response to that, Yahweh's response, Israel's God's response to that is no, don't do that. Well, why not? How can it do any harm? Yes, God says, because it's getting in the way of you noticing what really works and where the real power is here. And I suppose to us that will be a contentious discussion, because we'd like to accommodate lots of different points of view. But what do you think, Owen? Is there a case for saying today, Asherah poles were clearly a bad thing.
I think if you're coming from a Christian perspective, you may well say that. Yeah, absolutely. I think that I think that it's difficult for us to really peer honestly and clearly into the world of Ezekiel and what it would have felt like, which really, is an honest kind of response to your first question, which was what would it have felt like? Well, we don't really know, but we can guess. We can hazard a guess based on some sort of, kind of supportive kind of material, but in reality we don't quite know what was going on and what it felt like. So I think it's difficult to assume, but what we do know, as you've just outlined there, is this was a traditional society where the politics and the culture and the sort of deification of leaders, or at least the responsibility of the leaders with regards to the gods, was a central part of life in a way that it's not now. And so consequently, when we think about people like Ezekiel, who we know was a priest, but we also recognize in tradition that he was a prophet, that prophets were almost like the political opposition to the kings at this time, and they were speaking often God's word in opposition to the king, or even in affirmation to the king. We heard in Jeremiah, didn't we, how the kings were surrounded by prophets who just told them, yes, what you're saying is right, yes, that's right, and Jeremiah came along and said, no, I think what God is saying is what you're saying is not right, and God is going to speak to you about that. And I think Ezekiel's doing the same thing. So I think what we're seeing here is a spiritual voice, like the divine voice of Yahweh, but also we're seeing the political voice, if you like, of the prophet, and speaking into what we call very political issues, like social injustice, like justice for the poor and the vulnerable in society. And I think that's what we're hearing. We're hearing Ezekiel speaking God's voice on behalf of those people. I love the pastoral tone of, I think it's Ezekiel 37, where Ezekiel contrasts the shepherds of Israel and the carelessness and the kind of lackadaisical attitude of the shepherds of Israel compared to the shepherd of Yahweh, that God, Yahweh himself, Ezekiel says, will shepherd his people in a way that is so pastoral, so heartfelt, and clearly was the way in which Ezekiel thought the leaders of Israel hadn't shepherded the people, but they should have shepherded people like that. I just think that's a very pastoral chapter, don't you think?
I think it's pastoral. I also think it's kind of revolutionary.
Right.
But let's have a look at that in a second, because just before we get into that beautiful kind of hopeful section of Ezekiel, I think it's worth just cruising through the difficult bits, the lurid bits, the bits where people are going to kind of hear it and feel awful, and then know that they need this hope, they need this shepherd, and they're ready for a new way of life. Let me just look back at what Ezekiel was saying about what had gone wrong. It painfully stood out to me that the words that Ezekiel was passing on about God were not sort of technical, you got it wrong in your worship practice sort of words, as heartfelt and emotional, sad, heartbroken words from a lover, and putting Israel's behaviour into the category of prostitution, essentially, which is really offensive. But it's saying, you wanted to have Yahweh plus a bunch of other gods. Well, that's a lack of faithfulness. And that sounds really harsh. And it was. It seemed to be God's way of describing through Ezekiel that they weren't adding to their lives by adding to their gods and things that were in the temple. What they were doing is they were just covering over the specialness of what they had. And then Ezekiel suffers this heartbreaking loss of his own wife, which strikes me as like, maybe that's the lowest point of all for Ezekiel in terms of his kind of performance prophecy. Like, God had asked him to do a lot, but he wasn't just saying and raining down judgment on people. He was suffering loss himself. But also the thing I noticed is that God is with him in it, that God is taking him through this process. And he hasn't got time to mourn, right? He tells him not to mourn, not to do the things that people would do if they were mourning, but just just sort of push on through it. And that sounds super painful. And it seems to act as a warning that God's people are going to have to do that as well. There's going to be a lot of suffering, but God's going to be walking through them with it. And then it sort of turns a corner as to what God's saying to other nations. The nations that thought, oh yeah, the defeat of Israel, that means our gods were right then. We were right and they were wrong and their gods rubbish. What did you notice about that?
It's evident that, one, Ezekiel's very good at geography and history, because he's clearly got a clear idea about what's going on in all these different nations and characterizes them very well, particularly the Tyre and Egypt. But I think what we're seeing here is, as you say, is that the words to these nations are very personal as they are to Israel and Judah. And I don't know if you noticed this, but I noticed that he said of Tyre, you were in Eden. You were anointed as a garden cherub. You were blameless. You know, it was like just because the people that lived in Tyre weren't a part of Judah or Israel didn't mean that they weren't part of God's creation, subject to God's love and God's kindness and God's devotion. We see a similar thing. Ezekiel speaking God's words to Egypt as well, and comparing Egypt to like a cedar, which is a fine tree. You know, like the cedars of Egypt were even greater than the cedars of Eden. You know, it's kind of like just this sense of the value that he placed upon these nations. And also I think what we're seeing as well from Ezekiel is this promise that, and I find this later on as part of the hope, is that actually not only will Israel and Judah be restored, but those living in Egypt will be returned to their land. There's almost this kind of faithfulness, a judgment and faithfulness, not just on Israel and Judah, but also to all of the surrounding nations around them, and that Yahweh is bigger than just the Jewish God. I think Ezekiel sees that, and I think we see that particularly with this movement of the glory of God, the throne of God, which of course we see in Ezekiel chapter 1. We see Ezekiel having a vision of God enthroned on a throne, which to my mind, it sounds funny, but this throne's got wheels on it. Now, living in the 21st century, I'm imagining Pirelli tires or something, Michelin tires or something on with kind of nice alloys. But actually, of course, it would have been some form of wheel back then. But the idea being that the presence of God, the glory of God, which so characterized the identity of the Judeans and the Israelites, that wasn't just located in the temple. That when they went into exile, Yahweh went with them, the glory of God went with them. And I think Ezekiel has this big vision of judgment, but hope, not just for Judah and Israel, but for all the nations that surround them as well. And I find that really encouraging. That gives me hope, as someone that's not a Jew. That gives me hope that God is for me as well. I don't know about you. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think I wouldn't have known anything about Tyre. It sounds like a fascinating place.
Yes.
The way it's sort of esteemed in Ezekiel's words, not written off as some rubbishy thing, but esteemed because of all the stuff they managed to do, and God's love for them really comes through. And then it seems tragic that he pronounces a horrible end and they will be no more. Oh yeah, and then we forgot all about them. But they were people who had all their trust in trading, had all their trust in commerce, and maybe built brilliant things like that. And all the words to Egypt as well. We know more about Egypt because of the things that have been left behind historically, as well as Egypt carrying on today as a nation. And what Ezekiel was saying to them almost sounded like what he was saying to Israel. I will disperse you. And curses raining down on Pharaoh. You'll be broken. You'll lie among the uncircumcised. Oh no, well he wasn't, and he wasn't Jewish, so yeah, obviously he wasn't circumcised. But the way that it all looks, that God's vision that's coming through Ezekiel all looks like it is very holistic for the world as a whole, and not just a directed thing. It wasn't just that God loved Israel. It's that God loves so many nations and so many people, and has this hope for so many nations and so many people, that therefore that has to work differently then from the Jewish religion, because the way into the Jewish religion wasn't open to everybody. You had to be circumcised. You had to be in a family tree to get back and start rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. So what's going on? I think at this point, that was probably just a bit mysterious, maybe just a sense that God is so much bigger, but we don't know how all this is going to work out. What really grabs my attention then is, firstly, Ezekiel's restoration into a role of watchman. That we talked about watchmen before. Like, what a fascinating kind of job that is, to have responsibility for someone else, whether or not they go wrong. But I think the thing that struck me about that is if God gave someone responsibility to help guide other people, he also must have given them power to do that. And so maybe Ezekiel is starting to show a sign of renewal of order, a renewal of, there is a way of life that's possible, even without the temple, even without Jerusalem, even without all that religious structure in place. There's a way of life possible where we can properly connect with God. And God's just saying through Ezekiel, I'm going to make you someone who can do that, who can lead that, who can be that. And if I can do it with you, who else can I do it with? That struck me as quite intriguing. And then the picture that you mentioned as well of the shepherd, that your sheep without a shepherd. Now, we are recording this at an interesting time where there is a restoration and a renewal going on in America that some people are really excited about. The restoration of President Donald Trump and our expectations about what kind of leaders you're going to be. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned Donald Trump because we'll all have feelings about that might be quite polarizing about this. But I just want to sort of reflect in general. What would you think when you say we're coming back, we're going to restore, we're going to get it bigger and better this time? It's all going to be amazing. What kind of leadership would you expect to come in that situation? Would you expect a kind of humble leadership approach, a kind of we're going to listen and learn kind of leadership? Does that sound like that? Or does it sound more like, actually, we know what we're doing this time. We're going to take a deep breath and we're going to be more bold. We're going to be more strident. We're going to dictate, basically. We're going to dictate how it is because we've had a long time to think about this. And now we're going to get on and do it. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think in Trump's case, I think the latter, but I think that in what we're reading in Ezekiel, it's the former, isn't it? It's a sense of, I'm going to care for the flock.
That's the amazing thing, isn't it? Yes.
This verse, I will search for the lost, bring back the strays, I'll bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. I think we have to see that comment within the context of justice. But the point is that there is a gentleness and a compassion about this leader that is looking out for those who are most vulnerable, most in need. And oh my gosh, do we see this time and again throughout the Hebrew Bible and throughout the New Testament that God's heart is always for the oppressed, always for the voiceless, always for those who are being downtrodden and mistreated. You know, we see it in Jesus, we see it throughout the Hebrew Old Testament, and I do wonder whether as Christians we've just seen so much of it we sometimes miss it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think the natural reaction to being shut out and then coming back in is going to be, right, let me carry on from where I was interrupted and carry on more stridently.
Yeah.
But as you said, there's another theme that keeps coming up in Hebrew scriptures, which I think is almost, I don't know if it's unique in the world, but it was certainly very, very unusual in Jesus' time. Like, it wasn't anything to do with the Romans. The Romans didn't see like this at all. The idea of servant leadership was so alien that Jesus had to kind of explain it all over again and try and demonstrate it in ways that were just as shocking. And all he was doing was borrowing the pictures of from Ezekiel of the Good Shepherd, and what it means to be a good shepherd. And even shepherds were standing around going, because Jesus took it even further to say, you know, the Good Shepherd leaves his flock behind, leaves the 99 sheep to go and look for the one, and the shepherds would be standing around there. No, that sounds like a very irresponsible shepherd. A good shepherd looks after most of the sheep, and if one of them gets lost, well, you know, they do their best. But my goodness, they wouldn't leave the 99 at risk, you know.
No.
Jesus takes this picture to the extreme of saying, no, this is God's heart, to go and search for the one, to the minority, the excluded, the vulnerable, the hurt, the broken, even at the risk of what would seem sensible to people, what looks like so we've forgotten the majority then. You know, and what do we find in our times when people are stretched and angsty? You know, for many people, that idea is, well, let's concentrate on the majority then. You know, let's not worry so much about the minorities, because I'm in a majority. I feel like I'm in a majority and I'm suffering. You know, I haven't got all the money that I need to buy things. I haven't. I'm going to blame this. I'm going to blame this on minorities. I'm going to blame this on whether it's immigration or other things that have happened that have diverted attention away from me and what I need and what people like me need. You know, that is a rising political voice at the moment. And I'd say, you know, it's difficult to like politically. I don't agree with that. I would want to come against that. But at the same time, I think, like, with compassion, you also have to say, well, yeah, you've got to feel where people are broken and vulnerable, minority or majority, right?
Yes, that's a good observation. Yeah.
If God wants equity, if God wants life and thriving for everybody, that's not at the cost of one group of people over another group of people. And yet somehow we've got to find our way to this future where everyone does feel included and is covered by God's promises here. And it strikes me we're not there yet, or at least we don't feel like we're there yet.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good observation there about, you know, people feeling downtrodden, left out, neglected, and you can be the part of the majority or the minority in that regard. I think that's a really wise observation, because otherwise we can't make head or tail of this. I think that what's quite interesting in for me in what we've just been talking about is the way in which Jesus was part of a movement, even within Judaism, that understood that to be a leader is to serve, and to be a leader is to care for and look out for the needs of the marginalized and the vulnerable. And I say that because at the time of Jesus, he was criticizing the religious leaders for doing the opposite, for not taking care of the poor and the needy, and for denying them justice. So clearly, you know, in the story of Judah and Israel, there's plenty of leaders who have just not done that. But Jesus stands in a great tradition, which would include Ezekiel, who are really pointing out that God's heart will always be for those who are most vulnerable and in need of his support. And I think that's really, really profound. What Jesus was saying, it was revolutionary, but it was only revolutionary because, once again, Israel's leaders had lost their way, as they had done so often throughout their history. And in one sense, Jesus is like the prophet. And, you know, people talk of Jesus being a prophet, you know, in the sense that he was a prophet speaking God's words to the Israelites, just like Ezekiel. So really, really strong observation, real important connection for us to make here between Jesus and what Ezekiel was saying.
Now, I think it carries on as well. There's another even more amazing picture in the bits that we've been listening to, where Ezekiel encounters these dry bones, and what he describes as happening is just incredible, isn't it? It's the restoration of life where there was only looking like death. So not just a picture of, I'm going to bring an end to this chaos and to this disorder and this suffering, I'm going to stop it. But can we possibly believe in a God who can reverse it, who can bring life back where there was death, who can knit bones together, who can put new skin on old bones and breathe life where the breath was still necessary? You know, you've got all these kind of zombie kind of like lifeless creatures that God breathes life into, and then they become an army. And it's not just a picture of what happens to individuals, it's a picture of the nation as well that he was going to restore and bind back together and breathe life into. And for everything we've just been saying, it looks like God's concern isn't just for the nation of Israel. It's for the whole of his creation, for the whole of the world. Now, whether or not we believe what literally is described as Ezekiel shares it, or whether we believe it's a picture of what God can do, I'm just wondering, like, how amazing is it to have that as a promise, as a picture? I guess the question is, do we really believe it? Do we really believe that God's that powerful to be able to bring things back together like that and breathe new life in?
Yeah, and that's a personal question that we ask ourselves, isn't it, when we are going through grief and loss and pain and suffering? Can God actually restore me? Can I actually get back to a place where I can live again? And I think that's a real question that everyone asks and everyone cries out to God for. And I personally would say I've seen that restoration and redemption in my own life, and that's my personal conviction that God is able to do that, and God wants to do that, and that's the nature of the person that we call Jesus. That's what his death and resurrection shows, actually. The resurrection of Jesus demonstrates exactly that reclothing of the body and the breath of life being breathed back into that dead person. That for me, the resurrection of Jesus is exactly what you just said there, and it gives me hope. And it also gives me a framework, a psychological and philosophical framework to live by, which without I would be just inventing my own. So I'm grateful for it. I think it's a profound story of hope. I love it. I absolutely love it. And of course, when we see this in Jesus, we're not just seeing a one-off. This is Jesus living out the fulfillment of all the history of Israel. That's Jesus, said, I've come to fulfill it all. His is almost like the recapitulation, the fulfillment of the history of Israel in one man. It's just tremendously profound. And I love that we see that here in Ezekiel. I love it. It's absolutely, it kind of strengthens my sense of tradition, if you like. I love that. What about you?
It's amazing to see like the ancient roots of what seemed like more modern ideas. If you could count Jesus as more modern than Ezekiel. But we do a lot of more modern sort of framing and reframing and remixing of worship around Jesus than we do around any of the pictures directly from Ezekiel. So I'm saying, Ezekiel's kind of like an interesting foundation that was built on what God was building all through the Old Testament and leading to fulfillment in Jesus and a recognition of what God's been doing all along. I think has to include all these amazing things that for me, I still, in my head, they feel like, well, it would be great if I could believe that.
Yeah.
But do I really believe that God brings life where there was death? Do I really believe that if I've messed up a relationship so badly and it looks like there's no hope of going back to it, it's dead, do I really believe that God could breathe new life into it? Do I really believe that something that I might have hoped for when I was young and then gave up on, that there's a chance for to be able to share it, to be able to share kind of creativity or a hope or a vision or a dream with my family and help them in a hopeful way rather than in a well, my life's gone by and we didn't have time sort of way. Is there a way that we can breathe new life politically into our community where we see division and suffering? And it looks, to me, to be honest, it looks very difficult to practically work out a way of getting people who profoundly disagree about things to come together and trust each other and listen to each other properly. Does God enable that? Can God enable that? Is that a real hope we can have? I think one of the main reasons why I tend to think that sort of stuff would be difficult or impossible is the fear of running out of time or running out of resources. I haven't got enough time to volunteer for things because I've got to earn some money, otherwise we'll run out. Or do we have enough time to have a discussion where we listen to each other properly, because we're all busy and we've got other things to get on with. One of the things that strikes me about Ezekiel's encouragements is not just that God's going to come in and help us fix some problems, but he's going to massively resource us. This land, Ezekiel says, is going to be fruitful. It's going to be really fruitful. They'll be able to rely on not running out of stuff if their hope for source of stuff is God. And the picture of that gets amplified massively in the closing section of Ezekiel that we're going to listen to next week. So I wonder if now's a good time to get ourselves ready for that, because what's going to follow, I think, is absolutely mind-blowing. There's a temple picture which I think maybe might sound a lot like what you'd expect. We're going to restore and we're going to have a temple,
especially from a priest.
Yes, totally. But then what does that temple do? Not what's going into that temple, what's coming out of that temple. That is where the gold is, as far as I
love that.
See.
I love that.
That's the bit I'm most looking forward to chatting about with you next week.
Yeah, me too. And isn't it wonderful? I mean, listening to that, what you just said there, and perhaps we can think about this when we listen to this in these next week, is that this is coming from a young man, a 30-year-old man who's been training for the priesthood. On the day of his 30th birthday, he should be, having his first day serving in the temple, and he's sitting in a refugee camp in Babylon, and he has this vision of the mobile throne of God. I love it. Here's a man who is ambitious, passionate about God, and wants to understand and see the role of the temple reestablished amongst his people. And I just think just having that in mind as we listen to these final chapters of Ezekiel should encourage us. This is a man with a vision, and a man who's inspired by God and passionate for God as well, which is really beautiful.
He somehow managed to find hope from hopelessness and life from death. And so whatever's making us feel hopeless or down this week, we probably would have felt more down from the first bits of Ezekiel. Maybe the last bits can help lift us up. But it helps to know where he's been, and let's listen to where he's going to go next.
Yeah, brilliant. So we'll see you next week.
See you then. Bye.